Okay. Tuesday, June 27th. Well, I guess just before I call it to order, is there any member of the public with questions? Nope. In which case I call the meeting to order. Looking to the agenda, are there any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking then to the minutes. Oh, there are none. Boop, 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 boop. Moving all the way down to G1. The Lot 28 MR disposition at 201 Stewart Creek. Rise. Mr. Fish.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. I can be fairly brief as we saw a fair bit of background on this related to the rezoning public hearing that was held last week. But this issue is in response to Council Resolution 2016-167, specifically to review the MR that is provided in Stewart Creek Phase 3 and consider some disposal of that in relation to the MR cash and lieu reserve that was used to purchase the lot at 990 Wilson Way. This opening image does a particularly good job. It's actually related to another rezoning on the site from the past, but the green areas are the MR areas, and they show up quite clearly on there. So you can see there's 6 different parcels, which also shows up in the next map. So again, responding to the council direction. And so here again are the 6 pieces of MR, in this case in blue. And the majority of those have trails running through them, with the exception of this piece right here, which doesn't have a specific trail. We'd be reluctant to lose the trail connections because it's part of an overall network that provides important connectivity. That site does have improvements proposed, accepted for it. You can see a small pathway through here with a, try to be more steady, small pathway through here, although it's intended to be a little bit different from the sidewalk adjacent to the road with a couple of benches. There are also some waste containers, recycling and waste containers proposed in the area, and we'll have to, not proposed, approved in the area, and we'd have to do some planning around that, as well as some modest planting. To dispose of municipal reserve, it's possible. The Municipal Government Act outlines a process primarily around scheduling a public hearing, holding that public hearing, considering the input, and then requesting that the registrar remove the MR designation. So, to that end, administration is recommending that council schedule a public hearing for August 22nd at 5 p.m. to consider the disposition of the lot noted here, lot 28 MR, as shown. The 2 pieces that I failed to touch on in the visual presentation that I'm giving now are the financial impacts. We have received a copy of an appraisal of this site. It puts it at a little under $200,000. What we're trying to compensate for was closer to $300,000. So we're only going to be recovering about 66% of that, or a $100,000 shortfall. We don't have dedicated use of that reserve funding at this time, so it's not like there's an unfunded project as a result of that. But that's one piece to consider. I guess the second piece is just the alternatives. Council could consider looking at a different piece of municipal reserve in the Stewart Creek Phase 3 area. We're not necessarily recommending that, or we're not recommending that for the reasons that I mentioned related to the trail connections, or we could pursue some other MR disposal elsewhere in town, or we could just leave a deficiency in the MR cash and lieu fund. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. This is an older aerial photo. There's a small green circle here showing roughly where that little piece of MR is.
It's an attractive piece of land there. Thank you, Mr. Fish. So the intent then is to have the disposition first considered and approved or voted on, and if approved, then come back for the rezoning to local commercial?
Yes.
Or whatever?
Yes, correct.
And your report rightfully notes that there's very little impact on this in that neighborhood as a result of this, given there are no residents there, and people that buy into that subdivision will buy into it with whatever shaping we put onto it now, so it won't be a change.
It does represent some change. There are some individually owned properties in the primarily in the yellow lots on the left, the R1BSC. Sort of in this area, development is underway of some single-family homes and some duplexes. This is sort of part A of the overall subdivision, with part B being sort of the northern half of it, roughly. Those residents may have seen some plans for the subdivision showing that area, but we will be required to post a notice both on the site, in the newspaper, in accordance with public hearing requirements. So we will be letting people know about that.
Okay.
But comparatively, it certainly hasn't been a piece of MR in an existing community for the last 30 years or anything like that.
And the parts, thank you for that, and the lot adjacent to the lot we're talking about, the lot shown in red there.
Oh, I'm sorry, this
the
piece?
red.
Yes.
That's the piece of land we've always talked about, ultimately being the exchange for the road closure in the subdivision?
That's correct,
Right.
yes.
And in your report on the attachment 1, the site aerial photo, it notes that parcel is, it notes that it may be provided to the town in the future, as opposed to, I thought it was going to be, but until it happens, you're being
Yes.
careful in your wording. Okay.
Yes.
Councillor Comfort?
The intent is that, yes,
Yeah.
the red area would be the community land received in exchange for the road closure that we have already given.
Right, thank you.
So my question is, thank you. I keep going to call you by your first name. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Mr. Fish, for your presentation. And my question is, would this existing landscaping plan be in the budget somewhere so we would have a cost saving down the road, or would it be yet to be costed?
So this is, the improvements to the land are undertaken by the developer.
Oh, okay.
So it's in their budget. So there could be some cost saving to them if they did not have to do this. Time is somewhat of the essence because their plan is to do this work in 2017. We've had some conversations with the developer. Predictably, they're not thrilled about giving up a piece of municipal reserve land and then us turning around and doing that. But that's the situation, and they will have the opportunity to make a formal submission as part of the public hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Crosthwaite?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fish, for your presentation. Just with respect to the what's it called?
Everybody guess.
Just a second.
Disposal?
No, the assessment of value. Good try, everyone. Thank you. My mind went blank. With regards to the assessment of value, the appraisal, is it based on its current zoning or the zoning that it could be achieved with highest and best value?
It's based on a different, higher, and more efficient use. It's not an appraisal of it as MR.
Right. So, because it's only about half the size of probably some of those yellow lots and only a quarter the size of other ones. So that's why it's...
I believe it's just over 500 square meters. So
Right.
Depends on the context.
Yeah.
The lot that I live on is just over 500 square meters and is worth a fair bit, located downtown. And it doesn't really fit into the pattern of development as a single family lot or duplex.
Right.
It could be.
Will we get another appraisal at when it gets closer, if it gets approved and it gets rezoned, would we get another appraisal closer to the time of an actual sale?
Potentially, particularly if the zoning is different than what the initial appraisal was done as, which was done as a CC local commercial. Okay. So I'm not familiar with the details, but I believe the land sales and transaction policy is coming later this evening.
Yep. Yep. Great. Thank you. I just want to make sure we get what we can get
so
for it.
Assuming that that policy is approved tonight, any sale or disposal of this would need to align with that policy.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Fish, the deficiency that's going to be left over, I appreciate this coming and that we're going to be trying to recover some of the loss, but we're going to be deficient probably about $100,000. How would we take a look at that in the future? Is it something that stays on the books? You said that we could leave it that way. Would we be looking to replenish our MR reserve? What thoughts?
So that would be at the discretion of council. At this point, there's no requirement to completely replenish that, with the exception of the council direction. So council direction has been to dispose of that with the intent to recover that roughly $300,000. So this wouldn't entirely meet that. But like I said, there's no project that would have to be scaled back necessarily because of that $100,000 shortfall at this point.
Okay.
Clearly, the more money we have in the bank, the more flexibility we have down the road. But there's no dedicated project or requirement for us to replenish or achieve that full amount.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from council at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your report. And I'll then move to council schedule a public hearing for August 22nd, 2017 at 5 p.m. to consider disposition of municipal reserve lot 28 MR, block 21, plan 1611360. Is there discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item G2, an AUMA resolution. Ms. Van Kynpima. Your day to shine, huh?
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. I'm before you this evening to present an opportunity for us to make a joint submission to the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association Fall Conference to partner with the town of Banff to seek AUMA's intervention in lobbying for the access to Alberta Capital Finance Authority financing directly by our housing authority. So in Canmore, that would be Canmore Community Housing Corporation, CCHC. Right now, only municipalities, and another list, but basically municipalities can access Alberta Capital Finance Authority, which is actually right now the cheapest form of financing available. And so in order for access to that financing to be available to CCHC, they actually have to go through us. We have to borrow, then we have to funnel the funds back through. We have to have agreements, and then, especially for affordable housing initiatives, it is self-supporting debt in the form that, for the most part, if they're equity units or rental units, the proceeds or the revenues that come from those housing developments are used to service the debt that was taken to create them. And so then right now it means they have to funnel that back through to the town, who then makes the payments to Alberta Capital Finance Authority. So we are putting forward for council's consideration this evening the motion to put forward to AUMA. Last night, Town of Banff Council considered the same resolution and did pass it. The trick is that you can always choose to change the wording. However, to be a joint submission, the wording has to be exactly the same. So Banff passed it the way it's presented this evening. So in the attachments, the actual sort of resolution that would go to AUMA has a bunch of whereases, which explain the resolution at the bottom. So for our purposes this evening, for the recommendation to council, I just included the resolution component of it. But what gets handed into AUMA is the copy of the resolution, including all the whereases. That's attachment 1. Attachment 2 is background information. That gets submitted to AUMA as well. As well, we would need copies of council minutes from both the town of Banff and the town of Canmore to show that both town councils support that submission of the resolution. All of that needs to be done by June the 30th. So that's why I'm here this evening. So I welcome any questions that you have at this point.
Thank you very much. And I think we all know that this is a resolution that we've been talking about for some time to bring to AUMA with the town of Banff. So it's great to see the work has been done. And I'd also heard from Mayor Sorensen that they approved it last night. So that's great. I don't have any questions. I don't know if other councillors do. So thanks for your report.
Thank you.
And then I will move the council approves the following resolution for consideration at the annual AUMA conference. The resolution being, therefore be it resolved that the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association advocate for the amendment of the Alberta Capital Finance Authority Act, RSA 2000, CA 14.5, to include housing authorities created as Part 9 corporation whose shareholders are comprised of a city, a regional authority, a municipal authority, or a town, and the definition of local authorities to enable these corporations to directly access Alberta Capital Finance Authority financing. Whew. Would have been simpler to just have that up on the overhead, wouldn't it? Speaking of the motion, Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, I'd be pleased to support this. You know, we spend a lot of time and energy working with AUMA to be our voice to the province, and I think that when we have stumbling blocks that are keeping us from being able to meet our goals for our constituents, that we should do this more often. I see other municipalities in Alberta certainly put resolutions forward to AUMA, and this one's a long time coming, and I think it's well worded, and I look forward to seeing it on the floor in the fall.
I agree with your comments, and I also will note that the housing projects that we have been developing recently through CCHC would have been far simpler or less complicated if CCHC had that access to that financing authority, and the housing is it's being developed and managed by our housing corporation, but it's for our community. So I'm wholeheartedly supporting this resolution, and I hope it results quickly with solid results at the provincial level. Any other discussion on the motion? So now I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item G3, the policy review. Ms. Hyde.
Just one sec, please. Thank you, Mayor and Council. So, today's report on policy review is the culmination of a process that started back in 2016. At that time, we had a few issues before Council. It became clear that we could all benefit from some guidelines, clear guidelines around what matters should be addressed through Council policy and what matters would be more appropriate for administration to address directly, mostly in the form of things like procedures. So in January, Council approved some draft guidelines and appointed Councillors Krauser, Councillor McCallum, and Councillor Comfort to a working group that was tasked with using the guidelines to review all the active policies at the town and to return with some recommendations about which policies we should keep, which ones we should repeal, and which ones we should amend. So the working group met multiple times, and they met with me, the CAO, and the various managers who administer these policies to produce the recommendations. And I have the pleasure of
presenting those recommendations to you this evening. I'll do my best to answer questions as we go along, but I do want to mention councillors from the working group, if you feel like jumping in to answer a question, you are more than welcome. So, going through your agenda package as presented, the first thing we had on our list are the policy guidelines themselves. The amendments that were, and I think I have a slide. Yeah, the amendments proposed by the working group that you see in the red line copy are mainly around adding clarity rather than changing the intent of the draft guidelines that council provided in the first place. There's only one change, which I just wanted to point out in the slide. So there were 3 categories in the original guidelines. The working committee suggested adding the 4th one with the arrow there, significant community interest. And that was meant to apply to matters that didn't really fall into the other categories, but still there's some feeling that there should be some council parameters around them. And the only example I could really come up with, one that we have currently, is our facilities allocation policy, which is it's a policy that it outlines who has priority in booking our community facilities like ice and playing fields and stuff like that. So that policy doesn't really fall into governance, organizational risk and liability, but in a busy community like ours, it certainly is of great, I think, community interest who gets to book what facilities. You probably wouldn't see that in every community. So that was just a quick example of what might fall into that category. And other than that, yeah, it was just pretty much clarity changes, so I would just pause now to see maybe if there's any questions just around the guidelines themselves.
You're looking for
if there's any questions, we can always come back to it. No?
On the whole report, on everything, or?
No, just the guidelines right now.
Oh, sorry, the guidelines.
Just the guidelines.
Blanked out for a minute there. Are there comments on the guidelines from any members of council? No, carry on.
All right, so the next thing we have that are the policies that the working group proposed that we repeal immediately tonight. I just wanted to mention that, as you can see, we didn't attach all the policies for you to have a look at, but I did want to mention that they are available on request. Should any members of the public want to see something that was repealed or have any questions, those are available. And I know council did have access to them on an internal, one of our internal drives. So hopefully you all had a chance to look at those as well, an internal folder. So there was 3 main reasons in the end that the working group used to determine whether policies should be repealed. Most of them were because the language was really more around administrative procedure than they were around policy. And you can see in the reasons in your attachment, those are, it says, should be a procedure, not a policy. There was a few of them that could be better addressed or are better addressed elsewhere. A few of them, since the time that they were policies, have become addressed in provincial legislation. A few of them we've recommended for rolling up into other existing policies. And I think some things have migrated to the land use bylaw, if I'm remembering correctly. So that was that reason. And then there's just a handful, maybe just 1 or 2 that are no longer in use. So we can have a look at them. In case anybody has any specific questions about one of the recommendations.
I have a comment or a question that touches on probably 5 of the the policies that are recommended for repeal. So a number of them, it's noted that the intent of this policy will be included in new policy yet to be determined. But we're repealing these policies, we're being asked to repeal them this evening. If we repeal them without any certainty on when the new policy comes forward or what it might say, we're left without any certainty on, in regards to the original intent of the policy. And I don't flag that as something I lay awake worrying about, but.
So it was, one of them was the cultural
cultural
policy.
was the one that flagged
Yeah.
my curiosity, and we talked about it at agenda review. So the intent of this policy will be included in the updated community events policy. But we'll repeal the cultural policy without any real understanding of how the intent of that policy will be captured in a new policy in the future.
So if I can jump ahead. Policies to keep. So for example, I'm sorry, I already just lost track. The cultural policy is going where?
Into community events.
Community events. So community events we have on the schedule to be updated by the end of this year. So I guess, and you know, the working group can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we thought that the contents of the cultural policy were so frequently referenced that it would be a problem to wait a few months for them to be incorporated into another policy. And when that policy is brought to council, the community events policy, the intent would be to bring the cultural policy as information at the same time to make sure that the intent was captured. So yes, we would be without the cultural policy for a little while, but we didn't think it was that dire.
No, and I don't think it's that dire either.
Yeah.
But being without policy and risk management and legal counsel policies and well, those two at least may have more relevance today. Councillor Krause, did you have a comment?
Yeah, many of those policies were simply so outdated that they weren't really of any use. There's glimmers and bits that, you know what, that could find its way into a new policy. But we're not going to be any worse for wear for being without those policies. I think for the most part, I mean, they could have just been repealed without anything being captured because the other policies would, you know, do in fact cover that. For example, the legal policy was very old. What's the date on that one? That was, yeah, 92. And it was completely outdated. It didn't match the way the town operates anymore. It didn't match the way that we would do things. It wouldn't even match how the legal profession would respond in answering it. You know, so there was the intent could be captured elsewhere, but that was for those ones that you're mentioning. It's just to save little bits, but we're not any worse for wear by having a gap with them.
Okay, thanks for that input. I won't harp on it any longer. Other questions or comments regarding that list of policies recommended for immediate repeal? Seeing none.
Let's move along. So the final piece is what we're left with, which is the active policies, which are included in your package in attachment 4. So the working group has provided a number of recommendations for amendments, as noted in the column, along with a proposed review schedule. And you've already seen, actually, one of the policies that was on our list today. That was the investment policy earlier today at the Finance Committee meeting. And there is a small misrepresentation in my report that I falsely advertised that you were going to see the reserves policy as well. But Ms. Van Kayampipa explained why we were delaying that one, and it's been updated on this list. You're also going to see package of HR policies right after me, and we have the land transactions policy coming tonight. So it feels like we're getting a little momentum working forward with this already. So it was really a good exercise. And I did want to make one small note. I made an error in some of the policy numbers. Oh, but it hasn't shown up on my, oh no, I made a mistake on my slide too. So the finance policy numbers were off. They're on this one. If you look, there's 2, I think, 1s and 2 2s. Sorry, this was a track changes version when I did it earlier, but it somehow has accepted my changes. You can see that I've got the lines there, but the changes are gone. Yeah, there was 2 1s and 2 2s, so I've just renumbered them.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to bring that to your attention in case you had noticed that. And that was really all I had to say about this list. So if you have any questions about the active policies.
I have one question, and it's just idle curiosity more than anything else. The in-street patio policy, which is one of the more recent policies council approved, the working group comments were that the policy may not have enough parameters to guide the CAO in permitting the patios, and the committee recommends adding some parameters back to the policy that currently set out in procedure. And I think one of the councillors here can help me remember, in the discussion on that policy, my memory was that the direction of council that time was just the opposite, to take less of it, or take more detail out of the policy and put it into procedure. Is that recollection accurate, Councillor McCallum, or Crowser?
Thank you, Your Worship.
You were looking at me.
That particular policy is actually what gave rise to this whole exercise.
Yeah, I remember that.
Because there was significant spread in the views of council of what should be in a policy. And so now, since that time, having revisited it and the committee having taken a look at it, it was the opinion of the committee that that should be revisited because the parameters are perhaps insufficient. So between that time and this time, there's been a process.
Great. Didn't really remind me at all of what.
Well, I mean, it was. I mean, if you would like to go back, I expressed some concerns at the time that the policy really wasn't policy, and but the original format, as I understand it, that came to the Agenda Review Committee, was too full of specifications to the point that it was a lot of procedure included in that, and so it was stripped right out. And I think, in the opinion of the committee, too much. Not to go back to what was originally presented, but perhaps having to be revisited.
Great. Thank you for that, because so my memory does serve reasonably well on that. Are there any other questions or comments on that attachment number 4?
If I might just make a suggestion, I think that because there's quite a bit of renumbering in that financial section. A lot of them have changed numbers.
Almost all of them.
Yeah, they all changed numbers. And then I think probably there's a change in the HR section, because there was 2 HR 004s.
Yeah.
If I might suggest that that when the motion is put forward, that it's just references with the revised numbering as provided by Ms. Hyde. Or
Sorry about that. When I checked it
Or as
earlier, they
presented.
were in there as track changes, and now it's gone back to this red line. So yes, for example, this one, respectful workplace, I think was one of the HR 004s that shouldn't have been. So
Yeah.
now it's 009.
Right.
So that's the third motion to approve new policy numbers is shown in
Yeah.
attachment 4.
I actually have a slide for the motion.
Yeah,
Yeah. So we'll just have to amend the numbers to match what I have presented on the screen today.
yeah.
Yeah.
So just for the sake of the motion, you're suggesting,
Well, depending what Ms. Hyde has put in the motion.
I put as amended.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so, yeah,
okay,
as amended would be sufficient.
so that motion would be approved new policy numbers as shown in attachment 4 as amended. Are there any other question or comments this time? Seeing none?
I just wanted to say a couple words about next steps once we've seen what is approved this evening. It's our intention to post on the website all the active policies, plus the approved policy guidelines, plus the review schedule. So those will be available to the public, to council, to administration, all in the same place. Then, as per the approved policy guidelines, once they're approved, we're committed to bringing back every policy at least once per council term in a format that will be determined by council, whether it will be several at once or another working group or however that's going to work in the future. We'll be looking to council for direction. And then administration is committed to using the guidelines when developing new policies because we find them very helpful. So these are just the recommendations, and yeah, all I put for the third recommendation there was approve new policy numbers as shown in attachment 4 as amended. And that's the end of my presentation. If there's any more questions.
I see none.
I'm a little surprised.
We're just rocketing through this agenda.
All right,
They'll
thank
probably
you.
all bog down when HR gets up.
Yeah.
I'll look for a nod from council. I could put the 4 bullets forward as one motion or break it into separate motions. Anybody object if it's all one motion? In which case I'll move that the council approves council policy guidelines as presented in attachment 1, repeal the policy shown in attachment 3, approve new policy numbers as shown in attachment 4 as amended, and direct administration to bring policy amendments to council for approval in accordance with the schedule shown in attachment 4. Discussion on the motion. I'll just commend Ms. Hyde and the committee for the work they've done. I intentionally sat on my hands when you were looking for volunteers to sit on that committee because I had no interest in pouring through policies going back 20, 30 years. I mean, really. Well, so you took one for the rest of council. You 3 councillors, thank you very much. And Ms. Hyde, I know a lot of work for you as well, and the various departments that manage policies. Clearly HR really buckled down and got the work done right away so they can bring their amended policies forward right away, but it's really great to have to feel that sort of kind of like fresh start on policies. It's great. Councillor Krausert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for those words. That our committee was quite joyous in going through these policies. But what I would add is that it's obvious as we went through about 27 years ago, there was a lot of policy work done, and then there wasn't the follow through. So that was one of the things that was our objective. We need to make sure that it's set up for success and that they can remain current going forward. So I think that this council and administration can be proud of this work on the policies, because it's one of the legacies of this council, is that in addition to our work with affordable housing, in addition to our work around financial policies and making sure that's strengthened, and transit and any number of things, to get the policies in order, I think is an excellent thing that will set up future councils for success.
I agree. Is there other discussion or comments to the motion from council? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on, as it happens, to agenda item G4, Human Resources Policy Review. Ms. Rogers.
Great. Thank you, Mayor and members of council. As Ms. Hyde indicated, I will be presenting to you tonight the changes made to the human resources policies. I'd first just like to introduce my team. This was a team effort, and so I will have, if you've got some specific questions, maybe the member of the team that wrote the particular policy come up and answer those questions, and also introduce our newest team member, Eric Martel. All right, as Ms. Hyde outlined in her presentation, in January of 2017, Council appointed the Policy Review Working Committee and just approved the draft, or the policy development guidelines. The working group was supported by administration and consisted, as you know, of Councillors Krausert, McCallum, and Comfort. The working group had held a series of meetings to review all active policies, and it was primarily from the feedback and discussion in the meeting with the Human Resources team that we used that information in updating the policies that we're presenting to you today. We also reviewed, as is our practice, policies from external organizations to ensure that we're remaining current with what current norms in the workplace are. Many of those other organizations that we reviewed were public sector employers similar to us. Additionally, we worked with the aim of ensuring that the human resources policies provide clarity for our managers in terms of their responsibilities and what is expected of them, and also clarity for employees, and also to ensure that the policies reflect and are aligned with the town's values and our culture. As such, we are asking Council this evening to approve 8 policies that pertain to employees of and employment with the town of Canmore. Okay? I will be presenting the policies highlights. I'm really just the highlights, pardon me, of the changes for you, and then we'll pause after each policy to answer questions that you might have, because I think otherwise it might be a long time before you get to the question you have for a particular policy. Before we get into the details, though, there are a couple of themes, as has been discussed. I think Councillor Krausert mentioned, as did Ms. Hyde. Many of our previous policies were full of procedure statements and had a focus really on procedure. We have taken a very careful look at that in updating these policies and have removed that procedure where possible. So you will see in the summary of changes, the changes appear to be significant if you look old policy to new policy, but much of that is because the old policies contain procedure, and in many cases the old policies were still in our previous policy format. So we haven't included red line versions for you, actually, to try to make it simpler. If we had done a red line version of most of these policies, it would have been a complete red line. So in your package, we included the new policy being proposed today, as well as the original policy that we're changing it from. Okay. Are there any questions before I get started in the policy by policy review?
I don't think so.
Okay. So the first policy we looked at was the benefits policy. This policy outlines benefits received by town employees and elected officials and outlines the cost sharing for each of those benefit types. The main policy changes we had here were clarifying the scope to include employees and elected officials, just to ensure that that's clear. We also included all benefits that are provided to employees and elected officials. The previous focus was on group benefits only. So we have included an update for the Employee and Family Assistance Program, which is available to all employees and elected officials, as well as the corporate cost share for the Elevation Place membership, which is available to all. We have updated the definition of a full-time employee to reflect a 1.0 FTE. Prior to this, we had recognized 0.8 FTE, which is more commonly known as part-time work as opposed to full-time work. Okay? There is one employee who's currently eligible for full-time benefits at a 0.8, and we propose grandfathering that employee out, allowing them to continue to receive full-time benefits until such time as that person either leaves our employment or changes their employment status. So it was a good time to make this change because we were only with one employee in that situation. We have updated our policy language to be consistent with the terms used by Canada Revenue Agency. So a healthcare spending account in the old policy became non-taxable healthcare spending account in the new policy to be consistent with how CRA references that, and wellness account credits became taxable wellness spending account, again to be consistent with how CRA references those items. Okay. We removed a reference to fire and rescue staff. Their benefits are covered in their collective agreement, so it was redundant to have that in the policy as well. And we are recommending a slight update for part-time employees to have the taxable wellness spending account no longer be an option, and to have the option for them be the non-taxable healthcare spending account. When this item was originally introduced many years ago, the original intent of the program was to provide permanent part-time employees with access to some coverage for health and dental, allowing them to use that health spending money to purchase health and dental coverage on their own, or to claim some of their premiums for health and dental group benefits. That was the intent of the program originally. And that summarizes the changes for the benefits policy. Are there any questions about that?
It appears not.
Okay, we'll move on to Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is a very important policy for our staff. What it's intended to do is provide clarity to staff for what it means to act on behalf of our taxpayers and on behalf of our community. It also provides transparency for the public with regards to what is expected of our employees in terms of their conduct and decision-making while they're operating on behalf of the taxpayers and as stewards of taxpayer dollars, resources, assets, and equipment. Highlights of the changes to this policy are a clarity of scope for who the policy applies to. Previously, we referred only to employees, and we wanted to clarify in this version of the policy employees and independent contractors. We felt it was important to ensure that the policy applies to anyone who represents the town and may appear to be an employee for our members of the public. We do have some independent contractors that the public doesn't know are not staff, and so we think it's important that the same expectations apply to them. Some examples of that might include contracted fitness instructors or contract employees who work in our facilities, have our business cards, and essentially act on our behalf, but it's not clear to the public that they are or aren't staff. So we wanted to make sure that this policy would apply to them as well.
That would include the property assessor and building inspector and...
Yep, could include folks like that, yes. We removed the intellectual property section of the policy as we address that now in the employment contract, so it was redundant to have it in both. And we updated the language in a number of cases really to reflect how these things are currently talked about in the workplace. So behavior and professionalism is now more frequently referred to as personal conduct. Use of town property we talk about now as town time and assets. Confidential information and FOIP, we updated to be the use, collection, and disclosure of information, so really trying to be clear with the heading, what we're talking about in those particular cases. Gifts and hospitality was updated to be gifts and gratuities, including some additional information on cash tips, which wasn't in the previous policy. And then secondary employment or business activity, we're proposing to be other employment. And that summarizes the changes to Code of Conduct. What questions do you have for that?
Apparently none.
Okay. We'll carry on. So next we have the employment-related legal proceedings. This policy provides direction as to when and how legal costs will be paid for or reimbursed for elected officials and staff when legal action may result from work that elected officials or staff have done on behalf of the town. This policy was reviewed and updated by our legal counsel, and the highlights of the summary of the changes would be the removal of any procedure. It again was a policy that had a fair bit of procedure in it. We made some minor editorial changes, and we updated the language from councillor to elected official just to ensure that there's clarity there. Any questions about that one? Okay. Next we have the general holidays policy. This policy provides direction on which general holidays are recognized by the town. There were no fundamental changes proposed to this policy. All of the recognized holidays remain the same. Really what we're proposing are some minor editorial changes and an update in the language to align with current legislation. In the 1990 version of this policy, we called those days stat holidays or statutory holidays, and now they're referred in legislation as general holidays. So we've updated the language to reflect that. And that's the summary of changes for that one. Any questions?
You're going to get way ahead of the agenda timing here, so.
Okay, so we better have a question.
There is a question. Councillor Krause.
Small question.
Okay.
I was curious as to why Canada Day is only moved to July 2nd if July 1st is on a Sunday. It's a Saturday this year, so does that mean a lot of places, I guess, are taking like a long weekend, but does that mean there's no long weekend for the town?
This year?
Yeah.
This year, Canada Day is on the Saturday and will be recognized in administrative areas on the Monday. Yeah. Amy, do you have any other?
Doesn't that wording need to be different then?
Yeah. Yep, come on up.
I can speak to that. It's actually Alberta Employment Standards that requires employers to recognize Canada Day on July 2nd if it falls on a Sunday. It still allows us to recognize it on another day if we wish to. So it falls on Saturday this year, it still allows us to recognize it on Monday for administrative staff. But next year, when it falls on Sunday, the stat for everybody, or the general holiday for everybody, will be on July 2nd.
Okay. Does that wording, does that wording still fit then?
So this is, this just outlines when the stats actually, or the general holidays actually occur. Alberta Employment Standards allows us to recognize them on a different day if we wish to.
Okay, so by incorporation under 3.2, we're given the town is given the authority to do that.
Yes.
And go beyond what was actually specifically stated in the policy. Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
So Remembrance Day is an example. We identify here that we always will recognize Remembrance Day on November 11th. We don't switch it around, yeah. Whereas some of the other holidays move a day, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions on general holidays?
I see none.
Okay, so then we'll move on to the recruitment policy. This policy directs when new employees can be hired to the town and the principles that we honor in hiring. We have shifted from most qualified staff to those who meet the required qualifications and are the most aligned with our culture and values. In the last number of years, we have organizationally taken an approach of hiring for attitude, and we've had some real tremendous additions to our teams, as you've worked with some of those folks very closely, and this represents alignment with that. Where we previously required all recruitment to be centralized through the Human Resources Department, we are creating room here to be more efficient, and when some of our departments have the skills and experience to be able to recruit in accordance with our hiring strategies, we're able to let them go ahead and do that on their own and support them, rather than having them need to wait for us to work with us directly on that. We have some minor editorial changes in this policy to provide greater clarity around job vacancies, hiring principles, and some due diligence as identified in the definitions. We've removed procedural statements. That policy in particular was quite heavy on procedure. We talked about driver's abstract, reference checks, police checks. Those are all procedural items. And we've removed those all from the policy. This is, again, one that looks quite different, substantially not that different, but looks quite different. Any questions on this one?
I just have a question around wording in 4.1.
Okay.
And I understand what it's saying, but I'm having a hard time relating that to what happens. So all job vacancies will be created through a formal job requisition approval process.
So we have an internal process that requires approval before a position is created and can be filled, and that's just to ensure due diligence with our budgets and to ensure that we're hiring only positions that we have approved and that are within the budget. And this is the essentially statement saying I can't just go out and add 3 people to the human resources team without that approval. And the formal job requisition process is the approval mechanism for that.
Right.
I don't know if I answered the question.
That is how we proceed with new job positions. But job vacancies are also created when somebody leaves their post.
Yep.
So
we follow the same process there. We wouldn't automatically refill every position. Sometimes we reevaluate what are actually the skills and abilities and attitudes and so on that we're looking for in a new position. We may have a shift based on either the makeup of the team currently or what's coming to a certain department that they need to review. In the past, we have had situations where we have said, oh, we can't fill all of our positions. We're in a tighter financial situation. So this mechanism or this process, again, just has that oversight. It's quite a seamless process, but it does require manager approval. So there is an oversight to ensure that we're doing what we need to be doing.
So, still puzzling over the wording.
Okay.
So job vacancy, if Mr. Fish resigns, God help
Yeah.
us, that creates a job vacancy
Correct.
and didn't require a formal job requisition approval process for the vacancy to be created.
I see. Okay. I get. Yeah. I understand what you're saying, that, yeah, do we have to approve the vacancy? So does Mr. Fish have to ask for permission to resign before a vacancy is created? That's not the intention of what we have here. The intention is that a vacancy that will be filled only happens after a formal job requisition is approved.
Right, so once the position is approved by council, anytime it's vacant, then it'll be filled. Wouldn't it read cleaner if it just said all job positions will be created through a formal job requisition or something like that?
Yep, we could. Joanna, do you think you see any challenges with that?
Councillor Crosby?
Yeah, so I guess, good evening, Council. A vacancy is, for the terms of the recruitment policy, is only a position to be filled. So it's not, if Alaric leaves his position, there's a vacancy, it's a job that's available for someone to apply for and be eligible to get into. So what we're saying is we don't create a vacancy, we don't create a posting until we go through a job requisition approval process. So a vacancy itself, the empty position, doesn't really exist until we say it exists and that we can post into it. Do you understand what I mean?
I think I do. I think it's sort of HR speak.
It is. It's HR speak. Sorry. Yeah. So it
So
probably would be.
Job vacancy is simply an approved position that isn't currently or has never been filled.
No.
That's right. So maybe we need either a definition to clarify what job vacancy is, or we need to say all job postings are created through a formal requisition. So that wording would probably clarify what our intent is here.
One thing, just one sec. So the policies have to read, of course, so that all future members of council understand it clearly, not just HR.
Yep. Yeah. No.
There's a number of questions here. Are they all related to the same point, Councillor Crosby?
Well, I was just going to add that I thought it read well, because I think that we can't assume that someone leaving is a vacancy. I mean, I think that's the assumption being made. You know, a vacancy is a thing that is created when it is decided to fill a position, whether it's a new position or an old position. That vacancy comes about through that process. The fact somebody is left just means that somebody is left. Doesn't mean that that position is necessarily going to be posted again. It has to go through the process before it's decided if there will be a vacancy.
And that's what you intend with the wording. So if, using that terrible example of Mr. Fish resigning, that position is not considered vacant until there's a formal job requisition approval process. But in fact, that doesn't happen. There's not a formal job requisition approval process, whatever that is. The position is advertised. I don't know. I understand what, okay, I'm not gonna worry about it, but it's odd wording in my opinion. Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation. When these policies were reworked, the committee went through them and you worked on them together. But then when certain elements of the policy were put into procedure, did the committee also have a chance to see that part, or is that operational and that's outside the scope?
Yeah, that is outside the scope. The procedure is internal and would be able to be changed to be more fluid as other things occur. So one example might be that we used to have the driver's abstract as a requirement in the policy. Well, that requirement may change in the future depending on the position that we're recruiting for. And so we want that procedural element would be more in that particular policy of which elements they thought were actually policy, and everything else was considered procedure. And so those elements of policy have been retained within the policy, and everything else was stripped out as part of our discussion.
Okay, so each department is responsible for the procedure
Yep,
to
to support the policies.
what's been removed from policy.
Yep.
Based on the criteria that was presented earlier.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are our town procedures posted publicly, or is that
They aren't.
they're
They're
internal?
Yeah, I don't know if that was part of the plan. I don't believe so.
No. So just the policies
Internal.
are
They're sort of the internal operating. The difference was the procedures are how we administer the direction that we've been given through the policy, and so that really is very internal in focus.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Good. Thank you.
And to that point, procedures can change on a dime depending on what senior admin's thinking. And intentionally, some time ago, council started looking to remove any procedural things from policy, just because when procedure's in the policy, it's much more complicated to change the procedure. It has to come to council for an approved change. Councillor Comfort?
Yep, thanks for your presentation, Ms. Rogers. I just had a question about due diligence. It's point number 6 in that same section. And I'm wondering, is there a definition for due diligence, or is that an understood term?
It's listed as item 3.2 under the, we've just identified what we mean by due diligence as it
Excellent.
relates to this particular policy.
Thanks, I missed it.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
that's okay. There's a lot here, so
Yeah.
thank you.
Councillor Crosser, did you have something else? Are there any other comments or questions on the recruitment policy?
Okay. Next, we have the salary and wage administration policy. This policy dictates how the town compensates employees, along with when and how their rates of compensation may change. A couple of the big changes are really the title. This, again, was a procedurally heavy policy, as was indicated in the old title, salary and wage administration. So it really talked about administration of pay, as opposed to just the policy elements. So we've updated that to be the employee pay policy. Section 4 of the original policy was removed. It was procedural, and then we've made some minor editorial changes. Any questions on that one?
I'm not sure, it may be in here and I've just missed it, but there's a reference to the 55th percentile under 5.1.
Yep, it's now in new section 4, item 4.2.
4.2.
Page 68 of your agenda package. That we determined was a policy statement by council, and that, yeah, we've left in there.
Okay, where do I find that again?
Page 68 of the agenda package. Do you have the agenda packages or the policies? I can reference it either way.
68 of the agenda package.
Yeah, and about halfway down, 4.2.
Right. So I guess the question is so the 55th percentile is that policy or procedure? I mean, the 50, that's a target, it's policy?
Yeah, we thought that was policy,
Okay.
because you're setting a direction of where you want us to
Right.
to pay, yeah. The procedure would be how we make adjustments to that, which is the part we stripped out. But the policy piece was you identifying 55th
Yeah.
percentile.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions, comments?
Okay. Next, we have the time away from work policy. In this policy, we are clarifying all the different ways that employees received recognized time away from work, whether that's paid time or unpaid time. We gained some efficiency here in combining two related policies into one. That was another discussion that we'd had with the policy committee, and saying some of these actually had a bit of overlap, and we were trying to streamline that and put like things together. So here we've combined the former leaves of absence and vacation policies into this time away from work. Both of these previous policies deal with time away from work. That's not the regular day of rest or day off that employees would have in a week. We did remove in this case references to leaves that are covered by legislation. We had some duplication there in the previous versions where we simply repeated what the legislation required us to do, and that was identified in the policy guideline as not being necessary. Again, as is the theme, we've removed the procedure and updated language to reflect current norms in the workplace. In this particular policy, we are recommending one change to the policy content, and that would be from vacation eligibility. We are recommending changing the final stage of vacation eligibility from on your 20th anniversary to on your 15th anniversary. It really is no longer the norm in workplaces for employees to stay for 20 or 25 years with a single employer. That just simply isn't happening anymore, and we wanted to recognize that.
Occasionally. Occasionally,
yes. You will have noticed at our employee recognition, though, the number of employees at the higher end is certainly getting smaller. Progressive employers recognize the value that employees place on vacation, and really offering vacation more reasonably is a great way to show employees how we value them. The change in increments to every 5 years instead of 5, 5, and 10 years also promotes a greater level of fairness across the organization, and recognizing milestones that are achievable and having consistent milestones for all employees. So every 5 years, a change to the vacation promotes a greater level of fairness across the board. That summarizes the changes to time away from work. What questions do you have about this one?
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. So when you change the criteria for the vacation, you don't go back in time.
No,
right?
we would.
It just always goes forward.
When the policy becomes effective, we would move forward. But any employees that are now between 15 and 20 years of service, we would recognize this
as
change, but we wouldn't go back in time. And so it is actually a small number of employees if we were to make that change now, what that is, hopefully not a B, we would have, it's like this big. Okay. Sorry. It's really annoying. Maybe someone could kill it now. Can you kill it with your laptop? We have 11 employees that would have a change in 2017. Thank you. But if it's on my head, don't do it.
Infrastructure.
The closer's coming in. Is that there? Oh, look.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for saying it. My apologies for the,
Yeah, it was buzzing me a little while
Yes,
ago.
it was, yeah, I don't know. It likes us, I guess. So this policy is approved. We would have 11 employees in 2017 who would be impacted. One of those would be prorated because their anniversary is in this year. But in 2018, there would be 1 employee. 2019, there would be 2, and in 2022. So there's a minimal impact, but it is allowing us, hopefully, to recognize employees sooner. But this impact to current employees is relatively minor.
And you have a formula for carrying forward part of unused vacation?
We do. We allow up to 50% if there's a plan that's been reviewed and approved with the manager, so that we can manage and ensure that we don't have high liabilities for the town. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for that policy? Seeing none?
Okay, then we're on to the last one, which is the travel expenses and reimbursement policy. So in this policy, we added some clarity for restrictions around mileage reimbursement, including discussion around in-town travel. That was something that with the committee we had agreed was not very clear and needed to be addressed. We made some minor editorial changes and again removed procedure. So that's the summary for that one. Any questions on the travel expense claims?
Looks like there aren't.
Any questions in general?
I still have a question about that, but I'm not gonna, I'll let it go.
Thank you.
It makes sense to me. But apparently I'm slow.
Can I ask this one question?
Councillor Sanford, oh, McCallum, Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation. It's been interesting to see some of these policies come back a few times over the last 7 years and watch them change. I just thought I would take an opportunity to go back to the benefits policy and ask a question to you that I get quite frequently in the community, not super frequently anymore, but has to do with pension. So, and always an opportunity to take learning and hand it back out. Are Town of Canmore employees eligible for any kind of defined pension plan through LAPP or any other mechanism such as that? Or how are we pensioned?
Sure. The Town of Canmore is one of a few municipalities in the province that is not a participant in the local authorities pension plan. Instead, we have our RSP program, or our Group Retirement Savings Program, which serves as our pension. So it's a self-directed, it's not a defined contribution or a defined benefit plan. Employees contribute as well on a mandatory basis, and the contributions are identified here. The plan member for full-time employees contributes 5.5%, and the town 10.22%. That amount may seem high. It is intended to be somewhat in line with the local authorities pension plan, although that contribution number is quite a bit higher for LAPP. In order to be competitive still with other municipalities, that many years ago was identified as a strategy. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so that means basically that the Town of Canmore does not hold any pension liability into
Correct.
the future like some municipalities do. So we hold
Yep.
zero pension liability.
That's correct.
And I guess I would add that what is interesting about our form of pension is that your RRSP is flexible to you as the owner of that RRSP, so you could, up to a limit, put a down payment on a home,
Yep.
Which would be helpful, or further your education through the education plan. What do they call that?
Yep.
RE? Thank you, lifelong learning. So I
Yeah.
found that very interesting about our pension plan for our employees, and I thought I would like to share that publicly.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. I understand that the time away from work policy now encompasses the vacation policy? Is
Yes.
that correct? So wouldn't we then be required to repeal the vacation policy?
That is part of the process with all of these policies, to repeal the previous version. And just at the bottom of that policy on page 80 of your agenda package, there's a revision history which shows this combining of the two policies. So we repeal the leaves of absence policy from 2011, as well as the vacation policy from 2014, and they become HR policy number 10, which is now the time away from work policy.
Okay, so under each amalgamated policy, there will be a
at the bottom of each
recognition?
is this revision, which identifies which policy is being replaced or repealed. Yeah.
Okay, good. Because I read the vacation policy and then I didn't realize that it was rolled into the previous one.
Yeah, no, it's a
as
good
an
question.
amendment. Okay, thank you.
I had meant to ask a question more for clarification on the employee pay policy. 5.2 has been red circles, sum payment. Can you just explain how that actually works?
Sorry, I just want to pull it up, so I'm referring to your sorry.
So it's page 68 of the agenda, section 5.2.
Okay, 6 sorry, which number were you?
5.2, the
5.2.
COLA
Red
one-time
circle,
lump
yes. So
sum.
what we've identified there is that employees who are at the top of their pay band still face the same cost of living increases as other employees. And so this council had approved at the previous update the ability to pay the COLA amount as a lump sum payment to those employees. In the past, we had said if you're at red circle, there's no cost of living increase applied. And so this enables us to recognize that those employees also face the cost of living without increasing our base payroll costs. So it's a one-time lump sum payment as opposed to an increase to the base.
And we had a little discussion about this agenda review. So it's a one-time payment. What, with the first paycheck of the year or the last
We
paycheck
split
of
it
the
over
year?
2 paychecks. So one early in the year, one halfway through the year. And so if
Oh, I see.
employees leave partway through the year, they wouldn't be eligible
it's
for
not
the
a-
sort of second half.
So it's, when it says one-time lump sum payment, interpret that to mean it's paid once each year, not twice.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Hmm?
It's a good point. Yeah, we do, our procedure is to pay it out over 2 periods,
So
so.
it's actually lump
It's a
sum.
lump sum as opposed to a one-time, yeah.
Can we just consider that an editorial amendment, so I don't have to? Okay. And similar question on salary and wage administration policy. A few pages later on, page 73 of the agenda. Coincidentally, it's on 5.2 of that policy as well.
That's the salary, page 73 of the agenda, or 72 of the agenda is the old policy, the one that's being replaced.
Oh yeah, that's the old one.
Yeah.
Okay, so where's that reflected in the new policy? Is that reflected in the new policy?
Most of section 4 was removed as it's all procedural. So we did retain the cost of living piece as well as the advancement through the pay range and the pay determination at 55th percentile. But in the old policy, section 4 was removed as that's really how we administer the employee pay. So we had identified that that was procedural. Yeah.
It was just the direction in that 3-year-old policy around the wage review, comparing similar positions with other municipalities, and which may include local private employers. So that's no longer part of the policy, that review?
It is, yep.
Okay, so I'm missing that. Where is it in the new policy?
4.2, we say a market salary and wage review will occur at a minimum every 3 years to determine the 55th percentile of market value or job rate for positions at the town.
Right. So market salary and wage review, I guess it was the detail on 5.2.2 in the old policy of the comparison to or similarity in positions to local private employers.
So 3.6 on page 67 of that agenda package identifies what that market salary and wage review consists of, which is comparing,
Yeah, okay.
I think
Thank
just
you.
to your point, yep.
Yeah, that's where it's captured. Great, thank you. Are there any other questions at this time? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation. Is there any reason why any member council would prefer me to break this up into 8 motions? Or is everybody okay approving all policies at once? In which case I'll move the council approve as presented the benefits policy, the code of conduct policy, the employment-related legal proceedings policy, the general holidays policy, the recruitment policy, the employee pay policy, the time away from work policy, on the travel expenses and reimbursement policy. Speaking to the motion, firstly I want to recognize the work again that HR has done to bring these revised policies forward. I And I really feel very positive, and Councillor Krausert touched on this earlier, about the work we've done on all policy review, but this is a really comprehensive set of policies that HR has brought forward. And I think they really capture the current situations and certainly reflect our current practice in a very comprehensive manner. So I'm happy to support approving all of these policies at this time. Councillor Comfort?
Yes, I'd just like to second that sentiment that a lot of really good work has been done here by Ms. Rogers and by her team, and that serving on this committee with Councillors Krausert and McCallum was geek heaven, I have to say. So I was pleased to serve, and thank you for your hard work. It makes a big difference to clean these things up and get the housekeeping items and other parts of it that are more important than just housekeeping. So thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Good work. Thanks very much. Don't feel you have to rush off. There's lots more here. We'll move on then to item G5, the Sustainability Screening Process Update.
I don't know where the rest of the planning department is. I'm inspired by the support and solidarity that the HR team show.
Yeah. Really?
Feeling kind of lonely up here.
Really? Well, I'm sure they're all glued to their monitors at home, watching you, Mr. Fish.
There's only 2 people watching. I think it's me and you.
Why are you watching? You're right here. That's a good answer.
All right. I will try and be fairly brief here, as we're on a quick and effective pace here this evening, which is great. So, an update and review of the sustainability screening process. Very quick background. This is an award-winning policy. We've received a number of awards across the province for this, and spoken at conferences and have a fair bit of recognition. It has yielded a number of very real and tangible benefits to the community, so I think in that sense it's been successful. Undoubtedly, there are concerns around this process that are well known and documented, primarily that have been brought forward by BODA, and we have council direction to address some of those. And we are hoping to work on that in the coming year. In the meantime, there are a number of revisions that we're proposing that can make the process quite a bit more efficient and less cumbersome in the interim while we're working on those changes. There's 5 key changes that are being proposed at this time. It will continue to be required as part of all applications as currently identified, the thresholds that are in the land use bylaw and the districts. But the difference is
No. Oh, fly goo all over your hand. If you like, we'll take a short break while you go wash your hand.
I should have had the chopsticks like in the movie. Yes. Sorry. So the SSR process, it will still be required as part of applications as outlined in the land use bylaw, but it will not require a distinct decision either from council or the Canmore Planning Commission or the development officer. It will be considered as part of the overall application. Related to this is that there will no longer be a special development authority. So right now we've been in a bit of a middle ground area where some small to medium-sized applications were required by the process to be considered by the Canmore Planning Commission because of the sustainability screening report aspect that went along with the application. So historically, the idea was to have a more public review of the SSR, and we haven't found that we've had a lot of attention or input specifically related to the SSRs. So there would be no special development authority. Instead, the development authority would be sort of the quote-unquote normal If it's a statutory amendment that comes to council, then council is the development authority. If it's a larger development that would normally go to the Canmore Planning Commission, then that would continue to go to the Planning Commission. But smaller, particularly residential developments, and even some mid-sized residential developments would normally be decided upon by the development officer, not the Planning Commission. So we're proposing to make it consistent with other processes. That's what we just talked about there. As well as a small piece that we won't be required to advertise the SSR, the Sustainability Screening Report, specifically outside of normal practices. So we do generally advertise that we are having a Canmore Planning Commission meeting, but the actual application wouldn't necessarily be posted. It would be public, so it would remain part of the application and would be public for anyone asking about it. Again, yeah, where public want to see that, it would be form part of the application. Two other pieces moving forward. There is currently a sunset clause, and we're proposing to replace that consistent with the wording from Council's direction in 2014 and 2015 that I talked about a little bit earlier, to move the sustainability screening process policy objectives into regulations. So effectively voiding the process as something separate. The final one is to clean it up. Generally, we refer to planning policies, as we just talked about a bunch of HR policies, and so we would rename it to the Sustainability Screening Policy as opposed to the Sustainability Screening Process. So with that, our recommendation is that Council amend the Sustainability Screening Process as proposed in Attachment 2. This is consistent with a request from Canmore Planning Commission to align the development authority more with typical application processing. As well, we have reviewed the changes with BODA, and they are in support of the changes as proposed. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
I don't have any questions myself to bring forward. Push the button in, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. I had a question about 4.5.4 regarding the first reading. The applicant may present the SSR as part of first reading, but they are required to put it, if it passes first reading, they are required to put it as part of the application for the public hearing. Is that correct? So it sounds to me like it's optional that they presented it at first reading, or?
That's correct.
And so administration wouldn't be presenting it at first reading either? It would.
That's correct. I mean, we're sort of refining that process right now. In the most recent application that we had with first reading, it was sort of a combination. Administration outlined certain aspects of it, as well the applicant spoke about certain applicants. And so generally the applicant is better suited to speak to the benefits of their application, specifically the sustainability screening report. So yes, it would be up to the applicant if they chose to speak to that.
Okay, and would council get a copy of the SSR for?
Absolutely.
At the
so
first
it would
reading?
still
Okay.
remain part of the application
Okay.
requirements as part of an application.
Okay, so that's
Yes.
where I was unclear, but definitely by second reading it becomes, it's a part of the public process. Sorry, at the public hearing. It's part of the public
It will be
hearing
required as
package.
part of the application process, so it
Okay.
should be part of the package before first reading in the case of a statutory plan, for review at first reading.
Okay, so that clarifies it. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Are there questions at this time? I'll just make a comment. I appreciate that planning paused a little bit on this and brought forward a revised recommendation. I continue to see a lot of value in the SS sustainability screening process, but I was a little I was struggling a little bit with how to speak to the previous version of what you were considering bringing forward. So, and I think this is great. I appreciate the second thought and the work you've done on it. but I don't have any questions. Councillor McCallum?
Just a typo. I thought I would channel Councillor Comfort for a moment. Under the red line version of the sustainability screening policy, under economy, where it says municipal development plan, MDP sections 9 and 16, municipal finances. In the policy itself, the revised policy. It's the red line version, the black line version.
Yes, thank you. I've got it.
Page 98 of 114.
Yeah, it's part of part 2.
Yep.
Section 2. Yes.
There
He's not
any-
referring to flies that have been minced at the
Yes.
lectern.
Okay, we'll consider that an editorial change.
Absolutely, you should.
Are there any questions for Mr. Fish? Seeing none, thanks for your presentation. And I'll then move the council amend the sustainability screening policy as proposed in attachment 2. And I will speak to the motion. I sat on council when the whole thing started in 2007, and that was in response to several years of more significant growth than we've had since 2009, and council felt strongly, as did admin, that it was important to try something different in the planning process. We developed the SSR and then the process itself, and I think it's been very helpful and continues to be helpful by having it essentially forces builders and developers to consider their projects through the community lens and consider how they may shape their project to really benefit our community. There's been a lot of back and forthing on the process and the SSR, including challenges to the province and all of that. So we've spent a lot of time trying to make this process really work well. We have gotten notice and attention well outside of the region for this as a process to apply to land use planning decisions. I think if we can manage to do what we've suggested, which is to ensconce in the land use bylaw and what we have ensconced in the MDP, direction and criteria that negates the need for the SSR, well, super. We're not quite there yet, so I'm happy that we're able to keep the policy alive in this way. So I'll be happy to support the motion. And thank planning and BODA for their work on refining this process. Councillor Kraustert.
Thank you, Your Worship. I wanted to also appreciate the fact that this was pulled from the previous agenda and then brought back. I think that it's a better version. I certainly had concerns when it was presented before, because as presented it was contrary to council's direction of moving away from the policy, and I had concerns that in fact it would end up rescinding that previous direction. With section 6.03 inserted as it is, it retains the integrity of the previous decision while maintaining the policy. As everyone knows, I've been an advocate for moving away from the SSR matrix, but I hope that what has been heard is that the actual concept is golden. The need to turn our attention to these matters is absolutely necessary, and for that Canmore should be awarded, because it's leading in the right direction. But what we need to do is move towards areas where there's greater certainty and moving away from the uncertainty of the SSR matrix, which we've already started to do through changes such as this and previous. But I look forward to this process finishing up, and I do appreciate that we will keep the essence of the SSR or the SS policy being the objectives to look at those things that make our community more sustainable.
Other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking now to item G6, the last agenda item this evening. One more policy.
I think this is pretty straightforward. I should have borrowed your cape. I'm feeling sad now. Again, back a little while ago, when council was considering the issue of the land sale at Wilson Way, it came to our attention that we didn't really have a policy around offers of land being made to the municipality. What we had was a policy around when we were wishing to dispose of land ourselves. So council asked us at that time to look at adding some wording around making sure that offers to sell land to the municipality are brought to council for decision. So we took the existing land transaction policy, we did some amendments in light of the draft at the time policy guidelines. So we took out anything that was related to procedure or anything that was really just sort of explanatory in nature, just kept the policy elements, and then we added a section around disposal of municipal land. Or no, sorry, land acquisition, number 4. And that's really all I have to say. Are there any questions?
Woman of few words. I have a question around section 3.2, which is around the imposing of limitations, terms, or conditions, including such things as a requirement to develop the lands within a specified time frame, etc. These all apply to the sale of town lands. Is that the intent?
Both, on any transaction.
Oh, so when we acquire lands.
And this was taken directly from the old policy. The only change is that the old policy only referred to sale, and we changed that word to transactions.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if the policy would be cleaner if we had, I mean, there's section 4, land acquisition, which is specific to that.
Yeah.
And yet there's not a section that's specific to land sales. And it seems to me that there are different considerations.
Okay.
Section 5. Yeah, okay. Then I guess my question is the 3.2 A, B, and C. How does C particularly relate to the sale of lands?
True. For repurchase or transfer back. Oh, Mr. Fark.
Ms. Hyde and I arm wrestled over who should present this policy.
And I lost.
Yes,
You can see why.
but she did such an admirable job of writing it that I felt it was appropriate that she get the credit for it. So the question is, how would section 3.2C apply to the town selling land?
Yes.
So that provision is explicitly for that purpose. So for example, if we were to sell a parcel of land for the purpose of a purpose-built rental building, and we wanted to attach a condition that the development that occurred had to actually be purpose-built rental, and that it had to be developed in a certain period of time. And if those obligations were not met, that we would then have the option to repurchase the land back to the town, so that the reason why we agreed to sell the land in the first place could be preserved.
And is there any situation where 3.2C would apply to the other acquisition?
No, it would not. So if we're acquiring land, we the person we are acquiring it from, the vendor, could try to put a similar provision in place in that case. But the town, if we acquire the land, then we would not have a repurchase provision because we can't repurchase what we already possess.
So I think this word.
So we can, I believe, to Ms. Hyde's comment, 3.2, we could eliminate the word transaction, and the council may impose any limitation, terms, or conditions on a transaction, and we can change that word to sale. It deems necessary, including but not limited to, and that may suffice for clarity.
A suggestion.
Councillor Crowsford?
That could be one way, but just to keep the sales stuff with the sales stuff, we could just move 3.2 to be 5.5.
Also could do that.
Yes.
Okay. That would make sense to me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, 5.4 should be the last one.
Yes. So I suspect at this point we'll be asking you to approve the land transaction policy as amended.
And is it clear what the amendment is?
To move section 3.2 to become the new section 5.4 and to rename section 5.4 to section 5.5.
Great, thank you. And one other question. When 5.1, when selling municipal land, the town will use a competitive process open to any person wishing to purchase the land. And is that, I know this is a new policy, but just for clarity, is that reflected in the process we use to sell the Palliser land parcel? Is that how we proceeded with that? I mean, technically, not exactly.
No, I would say technically exactly. We went through a highly competitive process for the disposal of the Palliser land, which is consistent with this provision.
Sort of. I mean, we wanted to sell that land, but it had a constraint on it. We only wanted to sell it to somebody who was going to develop it in a certain manner.
Certainly, but that's not in contradiction with this. So, we'll use so any person who wished to purchase the land could have applied to be part of that competitive process. And whether or not they were successful in that process depended on the strength of their proposal. So that does not mean that we have to sell it to anybody wishing to purchase it. It means that we have to have a competitive process that anybody who wishes to purchase it may participate in, which is what we did. Now, given that we were placing restrictions on it, that may have limited the number of people who wished to purchase it.
You're right. Splitting hairs, but
Yes.
you're right.
Yes.
Okay, Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Worship. So does that rationale support us selling land exclusively to CCHC?
So the MGA sets out separate requirements for disposal of land by the town to not-for-profit organizations or for purposes specific to the town. So there's no requirement for the town to go through a competitive process when providing land to CCHC for the purposes of furthering a town objective of affordable housing, and that is covered explicitly in the MGA.
So should there potentially be a reference to that in this policy?
3.3.
So 3.3?
Yeah.
Okay. 3.3?
Yes. So 5.4, council may by resolution approve an exemption to part 5 if it determines the exception will provide a clear community benefit. So anytime you're disposing of land to CCHC, you are exercising what is now section 5.5.
Okay, good, thank you.
3.3 speaks to that as well. Are there other questions? Councillor Crossford, did you have a question?
I was just going to confirm with Mr. Fark that, in fact, what he described as far as the limitations is what is specifically spoken to in this policy and the previous policy about set limitations, and also our ability to deviate from process if there's a clear community benefit. So either one of the ways, whichever way you want to see the situation with regard to the Palliser lands,
Right.
we're aligned with the policy.
Yes. And as Mr. Fish has pointed out, we can sell the land at whatever value we determine, whether it's to CCHC or to a third party, in fact. The only difference being the obligation to advertise. So with CCHC, we would not be obligated to advertise. With a third party, we would.
Super, thank you. Thank you both. Since there's no further questions, I'll move the council approved land transaction policy EX 007 as presented.
Nice.
As amended. As amended and presented. The discussion on the motion.
Yes.
Councillor Cousart.
Thank you, Your Worship. I really appreciate this policy coming back in response to the previous council motion and coming back quickly. This policy, when followed, would completely negate what happened with Wilson Way happening again, because it would have come to council when the first offer was made to provide the land to us. And then council would have decided at that point. So I think that this patches up a little hole that we had that became a bigger hole, and I think that this is really, really well done. So.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll move council be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? Whew. Boy, did we misread that at agenda review, huh? Well, we did. We just wanted to